But yeah, this is the final session for today's boot camps. So we've got Jess and Emma from We Are Liquid to help talk about communication and marketing. And just, in terms of our sort of theme of the day is developing your idea or your innovation, it's really important in making people aware of it. So it's kind of how's the best way to do that. And Liquid are a company that, as an HSM, we've worked with a lot, so we can vouch for them from that side of things. So yeah, without uh, saying any more, I shall hand over to Jess and Emma to talk you through communication and marketing. So I don't know if you're on mute, guys. We can't hear anything at the moment.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear us now?
Yes, got you now. Yeah.
Oh, brilliant.
Thank you.
So yeah, like I said, thank you, Joe, for that lovely introduction. And yeah, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon on our presentation on communications and marketing. So just to give you a little bit more background on who we are. So Liquid is an integrated marketing communications consultancy. So we specialize in all kinds of different communications, from sort of traditional PR to social media to things like web design and website development as well, and social media management. So we do a little bit of everything, and like Joe said, we are the consultancy for the West Midlands Academic Health Science Network. So we're supporting them in their communications around the work that they do. So a little bit about myself. My name is Emma. I'm an account manager and I've been with Liquid for just over a year now. In my career, I've worked with both national and international brands across a variety of sectors. So healthcare is one of them, but also things like food, consumer products, and services, events as well. And we, like I said, we support with the day-to-day communications for the WMAHSN and also with things like events. So recently we supported with the Meridian Celebration of Innovation Awards, which were virtual for the very first time. And I will now pass you on to Jess to give you a bit of an introduction to who she is and also give you an overview of today's session.
Hi everyone, thanks Emma. I'm Jess, also work at Liquid on the West Midlands Academic Health Science Network press team alongside Emma. I've been at Liquid for a year and a half, but my involvement with the HSN account is mainly taking an active role sort of on the press office side of things. So this includes everything from building media lists to media relations, so talking to regional print online journalists about sort of spreading the news and the messaging about like the incredible innovations that are taking place in the region. I also help with the annual reporting and weekly reporting and all of that sort of thing that we do. We've actually recently done an annual report for HSN, which is just really important because it sort of gives an overview of all the activity that we've done, and it allows us to measure our communications and see how effective they've been, see what's worked well, see what perhaps we could improve on, see how many people we've been able to reach, and also which sort of outlets have had the most sort of like positive impact. So that's another part of my role that we're going to talk to you about a little bit later. But today we have a nice little agenda for you over the next half an hour. I'm going to be talking you through a communications checklist. the difference between PR and marketing. I touch a little bit on social media, just a little bit of a 101 on that. And Emma's going to talk you through key messages, channels and methods, press releases, the power of comms. And then we're also going to have a couple of minutes at the end for a short Q&A. So if there's anything that we haven't covered in the next few slides, then please keep them for the end, and we're more than happy to answer any questions. And we can also share our email addresses with you all. And if there's anything you come away from the session and think about, which is often sometimes what happens to me when I'm on these calls, then, you know, we're more than happy for you to contact us after. Cool. So to start with, communications checklist. When we're planning a campaign or an event or anything like that, it's always really good starting point to sort of have a little mini checklist, just as a bit of a outline for your project plan. So we'd start by recommending setting objectives. One of the methods we use at Liquid is SMART objectives, which you might have heard of before. These are just really important because it allows you to sort of easily measure the effectiveness of your communications, and you can measure against your sort of objectives and KPIs and sort of see what you've hit, what's worked and what hasn't worked and all that kind of stuff. But I think it's just really important to have these objectives because it just allows you to easily evaluate, and year on year you can sort of look back and see what's worked well, what perhaps, you know, you can improve on, and you know, evaluate against the other sort of trends that are taking place in the communications industry and all those other things that you can sort of take on board. Secondly, it's really important in any sort of communications to consider your stakeholders, your target audience and your key messages. So your stakeholders will really form an important part of sort of how you're communicating to your audiences and your stakeholders. And we also do some stakeholder mapping. So while all stakeholders are obviously important for certain campaigns or events or whatever it is you might be working on, you might have sort of stakeholders that are more top priority, and then those that are middle, and those that are perhaps for certain campaigns perhaps more at the lower end of the scale. So considering your stakeholders is definitely important to do early on in your communication planning rather than in the middle, because really, you know, you could be having stakeholders and promoting messages on Twitter, but really your stakeholders aren't engaged with Twitter, or, you know, you might be better setting out for a trade publication or anything like that. And then you want to think about your key messages. So apart from your key messages, is there anything else you want the audience to know? So often you'll have, you know, key USPs or anything like that that kind of sits as part of a really important part of your communications, but they might not necessarily be a key message. So thinking about those, we'd always like sort of think about how we can organically weave them into our comms, just to make sure that, you know, they are still being covered and we're getting the message out, but they just might sit separately to the key messages. So again, I've kind of touched on this. So really think about how to reach your target audience and what communication channel would work best. Is it traditional marketing? Is it more creative PR, social media? Just think about all the different channels. We're going to touch on them later in the session, but I just think establishing what channel would work best is definitely another key thing to sort of think about when you're project planning. And then finally, it's always important after any sort of campaign or anything that you've done to sort of evaluate against your KPIs once they've gone live, just so you can really see what has worked well. Difference between PR and marketing. So I've worked in PR about 4 and a bit years or something, and I still always get this question: what's the difference between PR and marketing? And oh, you work in PR, is that advertising? And all of that stuff. So I think if you're not in the industry, the difference between PR and marketing can be a little bit unclear, but hopefully after this you'll have a little bit more of an idea if you're not already as involved in the PR industry as we all are. But the main difference is generally that marketing teams boost public awareness and push the sales of a new product or service, whereas the PR agencies are generally more focused on maintaining a company's reputation. And one of the ways in which we do that is through positive media coverage. And the PRCA, which is the largest and most influential governing body for the PR industry, describes it as the way organisations communicate with the public, promote themselves and build a positive reputation and public image. So the way in which an organisation is represented in the media has a huge impact on how people perceive it. PR professionals try and influence the media to represent their organisation positively and communicate key messages. And another important thing I think is to note that one of the ways that we work with in PR is by getting that organic media interest. So while you can draft advertorials and pay for coverage, one of the really sort of influential things of PR and what makes it sometimes more effective than advertising is it's an organic interest from a journalist. If it's a radio mention, if it's on Midlands Today, or a feature in the Telegraph, it will be organic, and it will be the work of the PRs through press releases and other sort of work that we do that have sort of been able to secure that coverage. Social media. So we're just going to touch on this lightly because social media is such a monster, and we could probably have a whole day sort of talking about social media, but we just wanted to sort of cover a real key few points about it that will hopefully help you, whatever stage you are in sort of planning your communications or what future communications you're thinking of. As we know, social media is just continuing to grow. And it's actually really influential. It's so much more than just sort of sharing selfies on Instagram. While there's nothing wrong with that, it can actually work as like a really powerful communication tool. And it does this from everything from raising awareness to driving sales. It's really, one thing that's really important to note though is social media platforms and thinking about which ones your stakeholders are engaged with, and where are they consuming their news, where are they going to find out the latest about healthcare or innovations. Is it LinkedIn, is it Instagram, is it Twitter? There's so many different platforms you can go to, and it's important that your sort of communications and your content is tailored accordingly to which social media platform you're going to. We just picked out a couple of stats which we thought were quite interesting, so we wanted to share them with you. So it's just things to note, such as video content is receiving twice as much engagement rather than a photo or a text. And I just think that's really interesting because, over lockdown especially, there's been platforms such as TikTok, which is predominantly video content, which is just like sort of grown overnight, and some videos are getting like 80 million hits, or all crazy things like that. But it doesn't have to be TikTok. If you're doing a video on Instagram or Facebook or LinkedIn, generally the sort of trends we have noticed is that it's getting twice as much engagement. So if you haven't already considered plotting in some video content through your sort of communications plan, then it's definitely one to sort of consider and take to the board and see if it's budget accordingly, if you can sort of afford to put any sort of investment behind this. And then Facebook. So while Facebook has been around for quite a long time, it is still continuing to grow, and since 2015, while the usage has decreased, the monthly users have actually increased every year since 2015. I'm talking about Facebook. When you're posting, it's actually our social media team have sort of vetted this, and if you have a post with 80 characters or less, then you're going to receive 88% more engagement. And I think that just really highlights the fact that with social media, you don't always have a lot to sort of play around with in terms of word count with your communication. So it's really important that those hashtags or those words or anything you're using are just, really sort of planned, and really, you're making the most of those 80 characters that you've got. Another thing that we recommend and that we do for the clients' social medias that we look after is alternating the days and copy used in posts across channels to enhance content variety for users when sharing the same story across multiple channels. So, for example, it's fine to talk about the same story on LinkedIn, Instagram, or anything like that, or Twitter, but it's just you would need to tailor it accordingly, because the consumer that's on LinkedIn is going to be after something much different than the person who's looking for information from Twitter. So it's just really important that while they are sort of like they sit under the same umbrella, they are quite different, and what a consumer wants from looking at, you know, news on Twitter is going to be a little bit different. So it's just another important factor to consider. But as I mentioned, social media is massive, and social media marketing in particular covers a lot of different areas. So when you're doing your communications, you can think about organic social, you can think about paid social, also reactive community management and proactive community management, which is something we do daily for West Midlands Academic Health Science Network. Also, another avenue you might explore if it works for your branding or organisation is influencer marketing, and also social media live for events. So one thing we've noticed, especially in lockdown, where we haven't been able to sort of go to events in the way that we once were able to, having live social is a real sort of important way of bringing people together and making people feel that, you know, they are attending an event together and they can tweet along and commentate. And it just, not only is it really good for engagement, but it's also really good just for the brand and just, you know, to bring people together even when we're apart. And I think that's something that, you know, we've all learned throughout lockdown, but sort of tapping into social media in this way and exploring things such as live social and being interactive throughout events is just, you know, an important and thing to consider with your comms. But I'm now going to hand you over to Emma, who's going to talk you through some key messages.
Thank you. So one of the first, well, it should be one of the first things to consider, and also a really important thing to consider is your key messages. So taking it right back to the beginning, so what is a key message? So key messages is a turn of phrase or a sentence that succinctly explains who you are as a brand or a company, and what you want your audiences and stakeholders to know. So the aim of using key messages is to help build knowledge and authority around your brand or your product, and help move your audience's awareness along something that we refer to as a hierarchy of communications effects. So when you first start communicating with an audience that you haven't spoken to, they will gain awareness of you. That awareness, as you communicate with them more and more, will evolve into an interest. Maybe then they'll gain a bit of knowledge. Maybe eventually they'll gain a liking for your brand, which will turn into a preference that could then help lead to a purchase or some other kind of end goal interaction that you might want to have with your audience. So with all communication that we do, we want to try and continue to build that awareness with our audiences, and key messages play a really important part in this work that we do to build that awareness. So the first thing that we would suggest you do when you start looking at developing key messages for your company or your product or brand is to look inwards. So start with what's your unique selling points, what's new and exciting and important about your company or your brand that you want other people to know. And once you've got a clear idea of what those are, you can then start looking at putting little messages together, have a little play around, making sure that you've got a few simple, very sort of to the point. Also helps if they are catchy and quite consistent, these little messages. And once you have a rough idea of what you want people to know, then you can start looking at your audiences and tailoring these for your audiences. So have a think about who are your audiences that you want to speak to, what are they interested in, what do they already know about you as a brand, what do they know about the sector or the industry, Is there anything they're not likely to be aware about just yet? Is there something that you need to teach them about? And then kind of consider how what you want to say fits in with that. Then you need to also make sure that you don't just share the same messages with every single audience, because not all audiences will have the same interests or priorities or knowledge. So you need to make sure that you adapt those messages to your audiences as much as possible. And that goes for the language as well. So, for example, if you communicate with clinical staff or someone with a lot of medical knowledge, they may understand acronyms and industry terms, but if you're talking to, say, a patient group or a consumer audience, they might not know. So you might have to explain the wider sort of background as to like how you get to those messages and provide that wider context. So once you've done all that, you should have a clear set of key messages for each audience. We would suggest to keep it to maybe 3 or 4 per audience group, and then consistently use them across your communications as much as possible. So it helps build that knowledge and awareness and those positive associations. It will then, you might want to change up the wording. It doesn't always have to be word by word exactly the same, but as long as the sentiment is the same, it will continue to build that awareness. And also don't be afraid to tweak the key messages over time, because as your audience awareness grows and as their understanding of you as a company evolves, then so should the key messages, to kind of encapsulate where they are on their journey. So next point to kind of cover off, once you have your key messages, you then want to start considering which channels to use. So again, you think back to your audience, you need to sort of spend some time getting to know your audience. What do they read? What do they listen to? What do they watch? What social media are they on? Are they on social media? Who do they follow? Who do they interact with? To get a bit of a picture of where you can find them and where you can engage with them. And something to keep in mind, because quite often people think the bigger, the wider coverage, the better. But that's not necessarily always the case. Although being on national television is great, it might not always be the most effective way of reaching the people that you want to reach. Say if you're talking about a new product or care pathway for cardiologists, it might actually be more efficient to go down the route of a trade publication rather than national television, because you've then got a very specific audience that are engaging with a very specific platform. So I would suggest that you focus on a few principal channels per audience to begin with, to develop that relationship and engagement, and obviously that can grow and expand. And yeah, I think once you have an idea of where to reach your audiences, you can then start implementing communications across different methods and channels. So it can be things like press releases, where you're sharing your news, features and thought leadership, where you can give commentary on wider industry topics and issues, blog posts, social media as well, video content and other visual content like infographics, paid for advertising and advertorials. Case studies is another great way of sharing your work in kind of a different light, and as well survey results and research results can also be a really effective tool in communicating with your audiences. Quite often you'd use a mix of these different channels and methods. So one of the more commonly used and one of the most effective ways of sharing news about your brand is the press release. So in short, a press release is an official news statement that's been prepared especially for the media, written in a way that is as closely aligned to how a news outlet would prepare a news story themselves. So this really helps because journalists are busier and busier, newsrooms are getting smaller, but the output is growing. So journalists then relies on companies and organisations to share their news. So in a day, they can receive hundreds, even thousands of stories. So if you are sharing your news, you need to make sure that it's in a format and is targeted specifically to the right outlet to make sure that you cut through all the other news stories that are going out. So I wanted to share a structure of how we would recommend a press release should look like. So at the top, you would have a date line where you would put the date of when the press release is issued. You can put an embargo on a press release to basically ask the journalist to hold the release until a specific date. We would always recommend to use that sparingly and rather release news when it's ready. Obviously, journalists would adhere to this more often than not, but then that's not always the case, and sometimes they just forget about it between when it's delivered and when the news are ready to go. So I would always suggest release news when it's ready to go. Under that, you would have, or alongside that, you would have a letterhead and your company logo to instantly show them who you are and who this news piece is coming from. Then you would have a catchy headline, try to keep it succinct and informative. So really drill down to the core of what your news story is. Then you would have your introductory paragraph. And in that paragraph, you'd want to answer all the key questions. So who is this release from? What is the news? When is this happening? What is it? All those little questions you want to answer straight away. And the reason why you want to do that is because journalists don't always have the space to publish the full piece. So what they tend to do is they cut the press release from the bottom up. So you want to make sure that you've covered off all the key features, all the key news items that you want your audience to know straight away, just to make sure that you've got that covered off. And then following on from that, you then expand the story in each subsequent paragraph. You would also often include a quote from a spokesperson and someone involved with the news story or within your organisation. And then at the end, you would clearly mark, here's the end of the press release. And anything below that point would be further information for the journalist. So this would include a boilerplate, which is a summary of your company and other additional information that they might find useful to have. And we would always suggest you include images, and if you have it, video content. Similar to what Jess said about social media, with a lot of digital news outlets, we also see that pieces that have got images and video content get a lot more engagement than those that don't. So make sure that you consider images and video where possible. And also, kind of as a final point about press releases is that you ideally want to keep them as short as possible. Sometimes that's not possible, but ideally keep them to around 1 to 2 A4 pages as much as you can. Again, it has to do with journalists being keen to cut things down. So if they're already short and succinct, then you've got more of a chance to have it covered. to kind of conclude a little bit, so the question is then, so what can effective communications and planning achieve? So I would say that in the first instance, it will definitely help raise your profile and build brand awareness around your company and your products. It will help build strong relationships and maintain relationships that you've already got with consumers and also fellow businesses. It will help assist with the sales process and moving audiences along the hierarchy of communications effects. It will also help secure positive endorsements from third parties. So, like Jess said earlier on, it's that piece where someone else is talking about your brand, especially the media, that's an authority. So when read by audiences or seen by audiences, it's more powerful than, say, something that you've published as an advertisement. Also, it helps develop good opinion with regulators and authorities, because again, quite often they're a stakeholder and an audience that you want to communicate with. So it helps with building their awareness. And it also helps you sort of be on the front foot when it comes to criticism and crisis and issue management, and also dealing with competitors, because you're already communicating with your audiences and have hopefully helped build an understanding of who you are with them. So it kind of creates that little cushion of, or buffer, that helps kind of shield against criticism. So if there's a few things to remember or to take away from this, is that please remember to kind of align your communications, any communications you do, with your business objectives. That's the reason why we do communications. That's obviously what we're trying to help support. Then identify and consider your audiences, create clear messages that are tailored to your audiences, that really covers what's important to you in your organisation. Use the right channels, do your research into where you can reach your audiences, and don't be afraid to engage with social media or use different platforms and tools. It doesn't all just have to be a news release. It doesn't just have to be social media. You can definitely try and test different ways of reaching out and just share your stories. So to finish and to really wrap things up before our Q&A session, I wanted to share a great example of strategic communications planning and how it can result in media coverage. This is a piece we achieved in relation to a new hospital opening for circle rehabilitation. And yeah, it just goes to show how when you're planning your story and your audience and audiences, it can really kind of accumulate in a piece like this piece of coverage with Midlands today. So I will now start a Q&A session and open up for any questions.
Thank you both. Really interesting and an informative talk on marketing. I think, as you said, it can be sort of lots of different options and ways you can do it. So I think kind of narrowing that down and kind of having a real plan and looking at it from that point of view can really help. I think, Martin, have you got a question?
I haven't really got a question. It's just I found it really interesting to listen to that, because I don't do a lot with that in my own role. So it's something we're moving towards. So any kind of insight or knowledge for it is really good, especially as we're moving the service forward. So to me, it was really interesting. Thanks for that.
Perfect. Thank you.
You're very welcome.